Racist judge insults black man in court. 7 minutes later, he arrests her. For 24 years, Judge Evelyn Mercer ruled Courtroom 3B of the Jefferson County Courthouse with an iron grip. She didn't need to yell, didn't need to bang her gavel more than once. Her authority was a quiet storm, the kind that silenced attorneys, crushed defendants, and dictated verdicts long before opening arguments even began. The attorneys who walked into her courtroom, especially black defense lawyers, knew exactly what they were up against. She didn't need to say it outright. The rulings spoke for themselves. No one had ever dared to challenge her outright. No one had ever pushed hard enough to expose her. That's how corruption survives, not with spectacle, but with quiet, calculated control. Mercer had mastered it. Her biases weren't blatant enough to make headlines, but were whispered about in hallways, discussed in bar association meetings, and known among every attorney who had ever faced her. Cases leaned one way, objections were overruled on instinct, and sentences always seemed harsher for certain defendants. Today, that pattern was about to be tested. Julius Carter stepped into the courtroom, his polished shoes tapping against the cold marble floor. He had been here before, too many times to count, but today was different. He wasn't just another defense attorney standing before Judge Evelyn Mercer. He was a man with a plan. Julius was 48 years old, a veteran of courtroom battles that most lawyers wouldn't dare take on. His name carried weight far beyond Alabama, his ability to dismantle a prosecution's case, making him a threat to people like Mercer. He had seen too many innocent men buried under the weight of a system designed to break them, and he wasn't walking into this courtroom just to fight for Malik Thompson, his client sitting quietly beside him, falsely accused of armed robbery. This case was bigger than Malik. This was about exposing a judge who had wielded unchecked power for decades. This was about proving to everyone watching that Mercer wasn't invincible. Judge Mercer barely looked up as Julius approached the defense table. Her reading glasses rested at the tip of her nose, her expression unreadable, but razor-sharp. "Mr. Carter," she said, flipping through paperwork, barely acknowledging him. "You're already on thin ice in my courtroom. Don't waste my time today." Julius didn't flinch. "I'll try not to, Your Honor," he said, setting down his briefcase, but they both knew he was here to do exactly that. Julius Carter had spent his entire career fighting battles that others walked away from. He had built a name for himself in courtrooms across the country, known for tearing apart weak prosecutions, exposing corruption, and defending those the system had already condemned before they ever stepped foot inside a courthouse. He had gone head-to-head with tough judges, ruthless district attorneys, and juries predisposed to doubt his clients, but none of them compared to Judge Evelyn Mercer. She was a force of nature, the kind of judge who could sink a defense before opening arguments even started. Julius had seen the way she operated, dismissing objections before they were fully spoken, ruling in favor of prosecutors without so much as a glance at the defense table. She rarely raised her voice, but she didn't need to. Her words were blunt knives, sharp, precise, and meant to cut. That's why this case wasn't just about Malik Thompson. Yes, Malik was wrongfully accused of armed robbery, a charge that could send him away for decades. Yes, he was yet another black man sitting in a courtroom where the odds were already stacked against him. But this case was about something bigger. Julius had been waiting for this moment, watching, gathering, preparing. He had spent years tracking Mercer's rulings, combing through case files, identifying patterns, and collecting proof, the kind of proof that could finally bring her down. But today wasn't the day for the final blow. Today was about setting the trap. As Julius took his seat at the defense table, he could feel Mercer's eyes on him. She already hated him, and not because of anything he had done in this case specifically, but because of who he was. A black defense attorney who didn't bow, who didn't cower, who didn't accept injustice as the natural order of things. "Good, because I have a full docket and I don't need theatrics," Mercer said, her tone carrying the weight of a judge who believed her courtroom was hers alone to control. Julius gave a small knowing nod. "Then let's get started, Your Honor." To his right, Malik sat stiffly, his hands folded, his posture screaming a mix of fear and exhaustion. This wasn't his first time in a courtroom, but it was the first time he had an attorney who wasn't just here to play by the rules, he was here to change the game. At the prosecution table, Ryan Whitaker, a young, eager assistant district attorney, stood tall, pretending to be more confident than he really was. He had the look of a lawyer who thought he had this case in the bag, but that wasn't because of his own skills. It was because he had Mercer on his side. Julius leaned toward Malik, just slightly, keeping his voice low but firm. "We're ready." He said it loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. And just like that, the battle had begun. The trial had barely started, and Judge Evelyn Mercer was already making it clear. This wasn't about justice. This was about control. From the moment Julius Carter stood to make his first objection, Mercer waved him off like an annoying fly. "Overruled, Mr. Carter. Move on." She didn't look up, didn't pause to consider, didn't care. Julius exhaled slowly, keeping his face neutral. It was expected, but it was also what he needed. Mercer had been on the bench for 24 years, and she had ruled her courtroom with absolute authority. She didn't just favor the prosecution, she guided them. She wasn't just tough on defense attorneys, she crushed them. And today was no different. At the prosecution table, Ryan Whitaker sat tall, exuding the arrogant confidence of a young prosecutor who knew the game was rigged in his favor. His case against Malik Thompson wasn't strong, not even close. The only evidence was an eyewitness who had already changed their story twice, and a shaky police report that contradicted itself more than once. But Ryan wasn't worried, not with Mercer on his side. "The state is ready, Your Honor," Ryan said, barely glancing at Julius as if he wasn't even worth acknowledging. Julius set his jaw. "So is the defense." Judge Mercer exhaled loudly, adjusting her glasses. "Then let's get this over with." That was the moment Julius knew. She wasn't even pretending to care about appearances anymore. The prosecution began presenting its case, and Julius watched closely. Every time Ryan fumbled a question, Mercer gently nudged him back on track. Every time he struggled to get a piece of evidence admitted, she ruled in his favor without hesitation. Meanwhile, Julius couldn't get a word in without being cut off. "Objection, Your Honor. Overruled." "Your Honor, that's a leading question." "Mr. Carter, you are testing my patience." "Overruled." "Your Honor, this evidence was not disclosed during discovery. I move to exclude it." Mercer didn't even blink. "Denied. The prosecution may proceed." A Brady violation, a clear breach of the law, and she denied it like it was nothing. Julius let the moment hang in the air. He could feel the shift in the room, the way the jury shifted uncomfortably, the way some of the reporters started scribbling faster, sensing something bigger brewing beneath the surface. Even a few of the white jurors, who might have walked into this trial with their own biases, couldn't ignore what was happening. Julius could feel it. And so could Mercer. Her voice sharpened, her tone growing harsher each time she spoke to him. "Mr. Carter, you are dangerously close to being held in contempt. Mr. Carter, if you raise one more baseless objection, I will remove you from this courtroom." Julius remained calm, measured, unshaken. This wasn't her courtroom anymore. Not today. Because she had just made a critical mistake. She was so used to getting away with it that she hadn't even realized she had already exposed herself. Julius tilted his head slightly. "For the record, Your Honor, you are refusing to acknowledge a Brady violation?" Mercer's lips pursed, her eyes darkening. "I said denied, Mr. Carter." A wave of whispers rippled through the courtroom. Julius could hear the murmurs in the gallery growing louder. He could see the jury stealing glances at each other, at the reporters, at Mercer herself. She saw it too. And for the first time in her career, Julius saw something flicker across her face. Doubt. She slammed her gavel so hard it echoed off the marble walls. "That's enough. One more word and I will hold you in contempt." Julius could hear his own heartbeat in the silence that followed. But he wasn't nervous. This was exactly what he wanted. His client, Malik, clenched his fists under the table, whispering, "Man, don't let her do this to you." Julius didn't even glance over. He straightened his tie, smoothed out his papers, and then with deliberate control he sat down. I have nothing further, Your Honor. Judge Mercer scoffed, acting as if she had won. But she didn't realize the game had just begun. Julius Carter knew how to pick his battles. Today was not about winning a case, it was about exposing a system. As he sat at the defense table, he watched Judge Evelyn Mercer carefully, taking in every reaction, every flicker of irritation in her face. She was too comfortable, too bold. She had spent years ruling from a throne built on bias, believing she was untouchable. Today that changed. The prosecution called its first witness, a store clerk who had allegedly seen Malik Thompson the night of the robbery. The man looked nervous, wringing his hands as he settled into the witness stand. Julius recognized that look. Not certainty. Fear. Mr. Thomas, can you confirm that the defendant, Malik Thompson, was the man you saw that night? Prosecutor Ryan Whitaker stood confidently, as if he knew the answer was locked in. The clerk hesitated. The pause was long enough for the jury to notice. I think so, the man finally said, his voice uncertain. Julius didn't waste a second. Objection, Your Honor. That is not a definitive statement. Judge Mercer barely looked up. Overruled. Move on. Julius let a slight frown cross his face, just enough for the jury to catch. He didn't argue. Not yet. Instead, he watched. Whitaker pressed on, but the cracks had already formed. The store clerk kept glancing toward Mercer, waiting for approval before answering. He was coached. Julius had seen it before. Finally, it was his turn to cross-examine. He approached the witness stand slowly, with the confidence of a man who already knew the truth. Mr. Thomas, you said you think you saw my client that night. How sure are you? The clerk swallowed. I thought I saw him. Judge Mercer cut in immediately. Move on, Mr. Carter. Julius turned his head slowly, meeting her gaze. The courtroom was watching. The jury was watching. He tilted his head just slightly. Your Honor, I'd like the witness to answer. Mercer's jaw tightened, and I said move on. Julius smiled just slightly. For the record, Your Honor, you are preventing the witness from clarifying his own testimony? Silent. A few jurors shifted in their seats. The press scribbled faster. Mercer stiffened. I'm warning you, Mr. Carter. Julius nodded, stepping back from the stand. Understood, Your Honor. No further questions. But the damage was already done. Mercer had made it too obvious. She had taken one step too far, and the courtroom felt it. Julius returned to his seat, his work already in motion. The jury members exchanged subtle glances. Even Whitaker, the young prosecutor, shifted uneasily. Mercer had lost the room. She wasn't just biased, she was desperate. And desperation? That made people reckless. Julius folded his hands, waiting for her to destroy herself. She was almost there. Julius Carter had waited years for this moment, and he wasn't about to waste it. The tension in courtroom 3B was thick enough to suffocate. The jury had noticed the cracks in Judge Evelyn Mercer's control. The reporters in the gallery were scribbling faster, sensing that something wasn't right. Even Ryan Whitaker, the young prosecutor, sat stiffly at his table, glancing at Mercer as if realizing, for the first time, that he might have hitched his career to the wrong person. And then, it happened. The double doors of the courtroom swung open, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. Every head turned. 2 federal agents stepped inside, their movements crisp and professional. Dark suits, serious expressions, badges gleaming. Julius didn't react. He simply smoothed out his tie and folded his hands neatly on the defense table. Judge Mercer's eyes flickered with confusion, then something colder. Irritation. What is the meaning of this? She demanded, sitting taller in her chair. One of the agents, a tall man with a clipped demeanor, flashed his badge. Judge Evelyn Mercer, we need to speak with you immediately. The murmurs rippled through the gallery, spreading like wildfire. The jury exchanged glances. Even the bailiff, a man who had worked under Mercer for years, shifted uncomfortably. Julius leaned back in his chair. Showtime. Mercer tightened her grip on the bench, her lips pressing into a thin line. I am in the middle of a trial. Whatever this is, it can wait. The second agent, a woman with sharp features, stepped forward. I'm afraid it can't. A ripple of tension passed through the room. Whitaker cleared his throat awkwardly, his once confident posture crumbling. Should we take a recess, Your Honor? Mercer's fingers curled against the wood. No. Her voice was sharp, too sharp. We are not taking a recess. The defense has wasted enough of this court's time. The lead agent didn't blink. We have a warrant for your arrest. For the first time in 24 years, Judge Evelyn Mercer had lost control of her courtroom. The reporters scrambled to write faster, cameras from the back rows snapping up to catch every detail. The jury members sat frozen, their eyes bouncing between Julius and the judge. Julius? He just sat there, waiting, watching, Mercer's face drained of color. "This is outrageous," she hissed, her voice laced with anger and panic. The lead agent didn't even blink. "Judge Evelyn Mercer, you are under arrest for bribery, obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and violation of civil rights under federal law." Gasps erupted in the gallery. The bailiff, who had once feared her authority, took a hesitant step back. Whitaker swallowed hard, his earlier arrogance completely gone. Mercer turned her eyes to Julius, and for the first time she truly saw him, not just an attorney arguing a case. The man who had been waiting for this moment. "You," she spat, her voice trembling between rage and disbelief. Julius stood, buttoning his jacket with measured calm. He locked eyes with her and spoke clearly, deliberately. "This is justice." The lead agent moved toward the bench. "Judge, we need you to stand." Mercer didn't move. Not at first. Then finally, slowly, she did. And when the agent snapped the cuffs around her wrists, the entire courtroom watched in stunned silence. Not just watching, witnessing, the fall of a tyrant. And Julius Carter? He wasn't done yet. For 24 years, Judge Evelyn Mercer had ruled from the bench with absolute authority. She had controlled every case, every lawyer, every defendant that entered her courtroom. But today, she wasn't in control. The metal click of the handcuffs around her wrists echoed through the silent courtroom, ringing louder than any gavel she had ever slammed. The gallery was frozen, caught between shock and the weight of something monumental. The lead federal agent took a step closer. "Judge Mercer, you will be escorted out of the courthouse for processing. You have the right to remain silent." But Mercer wasn't listening. She turned, her furious gaze locking onto Julius Carter, the only man in the room who wasn't surprised. The only man who had been waiting for this. "This is your doing," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage and disbelief. Julius adjusted his tie and tilted his head slightly. "No, Judge, this is your doing." For the first time in her career, the system she had weaponized had turned on her. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. For years she had lectured defendants about accountability, had sentenced men to prison with cold, impassive rulings, had ignored evidence and silenced objections, all while believing she would never be held accountable herself. But now she stood in the very spot where she had condemned countless others, her wrists bound, her power stripped away. The courtroom buzzed with energy, a once-in-a-lifetime moment unfolding before their eyes. The jury, once unsure, now understood exactly what they had been witnessing all along. The reporters, pens scratching furiously, knew they had the story of the year. Even Ryan Whitaker, the young prosecutor who had relied on Mercer's favoritism, looked like he was about to be sick. She had been his safety net, and now she was gone. The agents moved her toward the doors, but not before one final humiliation. The bailiff, the same one who had once feared her, held the door open for her like she was just another defendant. Mercer hesitated. Then, with one last glare at Julius, she stepped forward. The doors slammed shut behind her, and just like that, she was gone. Julius exhaled slowly, resting his hands on the defense table. Behind him, his client, Malik Thompson, let out a breath he had been holding for years. For the first time in a long time, justice had finally been served. For a moment, the courtroom remained frozen, as if no one could believe what had just happened. Judge Evelyn Mercer, the most feared judge in Jefferson County, was gone. But Malik Thompson was still in handcuffs. Julius Carter turned to the new judge, Anthony Reynolds, who had been called in to replace Mercer in the middle of the chaos. He was an older man, well-respected, known for his fairness, the complete opposite of the woman who had just been let out in cuffs. Julius smoothed his tie, stood, and spoke with measured confidence. "Your Honor, given the recent developments, I move for an immediate dismissal of all charges against my client." Judge Reynolds folded his hands, his sharp eyes scanning the courtroom, taking in the weight of what had just transpired. On what grounds, Mr. Carter? Julius didn't hesitate. This entire trial was compromised from the beginning. Judge Mercer's arrest proves what we already knew. She was never impartial, and neither were her rulings. He gestured toward the jury, the gallery, the reporters still frantically writing down every detail. This case was manipulated. Evidence was ignored. My client never stood a chance at a fair trial, until now. A heavy pause settled over the room. Then, Judge Reynolds nodded. Motion granted. The charges against Malik Thompson are dismissed. Bailiff, remove his restraints. The sound of the handcuffs unlocking was the only thing anyone could hear. Malik stared at his wrists as the cuffs fell away, his hands finally his own again. He looked at Julius, his eyes filled with something between disbelief and gratitude. Man, I don't even know what to say. Julius clapped a hand on his shoulder, his expression steady, unwavering. You don't have to say anything. Because today, justice had actually worked, not because the system was built that way, but because someone had fought to make it happen. Malik stood, breathing in his first real taste of freedom. Then, without another word, he walked out of the courtroom. Finally a free man. Julius Carter stepped out of courtroom 3B, the weight of the day settling into his shoulders. Malik Thompson was free. Judge Evelyn Mercer was in handcuffs. The system had worked, for once. But as he stood in the dimly lit hallway of the courthouse, he knew this wasn't the end of the fight. For 24 years, Mercer had destroyed lives. How many innocent men had she sentenced? How many families had been torn apart because of her rulings? How many cases, just like Malik's, were still buried under years of judicial corruption? Julius glanced at the crowd still gathered near the courtroom doors. Reporters scrambling to update their stories, defense attorneys whispering among themselves, prosecutors exchanging uneasy glances. Some were stunned, others were waiting, wondering what would happen next. He knew what needed to happen next. This wasn't just about Mercer. She was one judge in one courthouse. There were more like her, sitting behind benches, handing down rulings that ruined lives. She had been caught, but how many others were still getting away with it? Julius turned, his eyes settling on the cameras now pointed at him. He hadn't planned on making a statement today, but how could he stay silent? He took a step forward, his voice steady, unwavering. Today we saw a small piece of justice. But this fight isn't over, not even close. There are more cases like Malik Thompson's, more judges like Evelyn Mercer, more lives that have been stolen because of corruption in our system. If today proved anything, it's that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law. A murmur rippled through the press. The moment wasn't just about the past, it was about what came next. Julius exhaled. The real work was just beginning. As he walked away, the weight in his chest felt lighter. This battle was won, but the war for justice, that was far from over.